Hi Gomes graduates, this is Mrs. Nunes, and today I'm here to do a writing lesson with you. We're going to be reviewing narrative writing. So I made a checklist to go over all the different aspects of narrative writing. But before we do, let's talk about what is narrative writing. So that word narrative, you might notice a smaller word inside. The root word here of this word narrative is this word narrate. Do you know that word narrate? That word narrate means to tell a story. That word narrate is also the root word in the word narrator. That's another word you might know. What's a narrator? A narrator is the person that's telling a story, right? So narrative writing is writing that tells a story, okay? So here is your goal for this writing lesson for the next 2 weeks. Your goal for this writing lesson is going to be able to compose a narrative writing piece using the writing process. Okay, so I would like you to use the writing process to compose a narrative. So the writing process, that's when you brainstorm, you come up with a plan, you write a first draft, a rough draft, you reread your writing and you edit it and revise it, make it sound good, make it look good, right? And then you publish a final draft to share with people. So this is the writing process that I want you to use to meet your end goal of writing a narrative piece. Now, what language do I want you to use to be able to write a narrative piece? Your language objective for this lesson is to be able to identify aspects of narrative writing using synonyms for the word has. So instead of saying, my narrative has dialogue, has is an easy word. Let's try to use a more challenging synonym. Remember, synonyms are words that mean the same thing. So all these words mean the same thing as has. Which one can you try? So narrative writing contains dialogue. Narrative writing incorporates sensory details. Okay? Narrative writing includes transitional phrases to show order. Or narrative writing consists of figurative language, like similes and metaphors. Okay, so can you challenge yourself to use some of these synonyms for the word has when you're talking about narrative writing and the different aspects or parts of narrative writing? Okay, so we'll be talking about this language goal throughout this lesson. So let's go over what belongs in a piece of narrative writing by using our narrative writing checklist. So in a piece of narrative writing, you need to include the synonym for has, right? You need to include all of these things into your story that you're going to write. So you need an introduction. So an introduction can be a paragraph, it can be a sentence. It just kind of orients your reader and lets your reader know what's going on in your story. It lets them know the setting of your story, where and when your story takes place. Right? It lets you know who are the characters in your story. Maybe your main characters, your main character, or characters. That introduction piece just kind of lets the reader know what's going on in your story before you start telling it. Okay? You also need dialogue in a narrative writing. So narrative writing incorporates dialogue. What is dialogue? Dialogue is when characters are talking in a story. So the character's talking out loud to each other, or maybe the character is thinking out loud. Anything that a character physically says out loud is called dialogue. And you need to use special marks in your writing to show dialogue. You need to use quotation marks in your writing. Your narrative writing, it needs to show a sequence of events. So it needs to have a clear beginning, middle, and an end with some transitional phrases. So now remember, transition phrases don't always have to be just first, next, then, last. Your transitional phrases can come naturally to your story. So if in your story you're walking to the store, you might come across a transition word that says, as I was walking, or as I headed toward the store. Those are also transitional phrases that show the order of the events in your story. So challenge yourself to use different transitional phrases instead of first this happened, next this happened. See how you can come up with some more natural sounding phrases. All right, your narrative writing needs to include, another synonym, it needs to include lots of description. So describing things, how they look, what they sound like, what they smell like, those sensory details. right? The more details you include in your narrative writing, the easier it's going to be for your reader to make a picture in their head while they're reading. And that's going to keep them interested, that's going to keep them engaged, that's going to keep them wanting to read your story. So details need to be included in your narrative writing, okay? Sensory details, remember the 5 senses. What you can see, what you can smell, taste, touch, and hear, right? 5 senses. Okay, you need to include some figurative language in your narrative writing. Narrative writing should contain at least one piece of figurative language. So if that's going to be a simile, right? I was as hot as the sun as I was walking to school that day. Or maybe a metaphor. I was a ball of fire. I was so mad. An idiom. She gave me the cold shoulder when we got into an argument, right? She gave me the cold shoulder. That means she ignored you. So an idiom, a figure of speech. Or maybe onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is when you include a sound in your writing. So maybe you have a bell that rings in your story, so you write ring. Or maybe you have a bee that's buzzing by, so you write the sound buzz. Okay, so that's another example of figurative language, is onomatopoeia, including a sound in your writing. And of course, every story needs a conclusion, a natural ending to your story. It doesn't have to say at the end or last. It could be when you find the solution to your problem, could be the ending of your story. So I want you to use this checklist this week as you're working on your rough draft of your narrative writing. So what do I want you to write about? Well, I'm going to really leave that up to you. I have a list of ideas of what you could write about if you really don't know what you want to write about. But remember that narrative writing is writing that tells a story. So what do you want to tell a story about? Here are some ideas that I came up with. Okay, I'm going to share with you a document called The Glowing Shoes, which is a student example. A 4th grader in Massachusetts wrote the story called The Glowing Shoes. So I'm going to share this story on the document, on the assignment, and I have highlighted in that story all the different elements that student included in their narrative writing. And I commented, so I want you to read that story, The Glowing Shoes, and read my comments so you can see all of the different examples of the aspects of narrative writing that student included in their writing. But here are some ideas I came up with for topics you could write a story about. Narrative story ideas. If you like the glowing shoe story, maybe you find a pair of glowing shoes. And what happens next? How about you get lost on a family road trip? That could be fun. Ooh, what happens when you find a treasure map? Tell a story about a time when you find a treasure map. Now remember, does a narrative story have to be, does it have to be true? Does it have to be non-fiction? A narrative story can be fiction. Like, think about the story, The Wacky Shoes, that you read, with the shoes that led the girl up the tree and walked her all around. She couldn't control which way she was going. Now, that story wasn't really a true story, but it still tells a story, so it is an example of narrative writing. So you could make up a story. It could be fiction. You could tell a story of something funny or something scary that happened to you. Maybe you write a story about a time when you moved to a new state or a new country or a new home, like we did in school, or anything that you can tell a story about. So these are my ideas. You can also talk to your teacher about what you have for an idea about what to write your narrative about. I wanted to leave it open because I just wanted to see what you would show us for narrative writing this week. So it's up to you. I want to see what you want to write about, but I do want to see you include all of these aspects of narrative writing into your rough draft. So this Friday, a rough draft will be due to your teacher. It's up to you how you want to share that with your teacher. I put a Google document on this assignment for you to type a rough draft. Okay? But just remember, let's keep in mind our language objective for this lesson. Were you able to meet this goal? Are you able to describe and identify the parts of narrative writing using this synonym for the word has? Have you tried using any of these words? I used a bunch of them during this lesson, so I hope that you heard me using these synonyms and tried them on your own. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to read to you that story, The Glowing Shoes, and we'll talk about the different parts of narrative writing.